Right. And then now Hawaii imports 86% of its food.
Because I can improve without my slides if that's.
No, I mean, you're welcome to do that. I will just film you on here. Oh, yeah, that's a good idea.
Sorry, technical stuff. There we go. So yeah, good morning. Can you hear me well? So just like the rest of my colleagues here, I'm really honored to be part of this panel and engage with the brilliant work of Professor Aniket. I'm relatively new to this STS space and agri-biotechnology, and because I'm actually a lawyer doing like legal reform work for most of my life. And right now I'm a faculty member at the University of the Philippines, Los Baños. So, it was working earlier. Yeah, but if it's not, I can really go with it.
This was this. You want to try?
Oh, yeah. So maybe I should just away from it a bit. Okay, yeah. So I'm Damsel, and yeah, I'm a faculty member of the University of the Philippines, Los Baños, which is the local developer of the genetically modified eggplant in the Philippines, the same BT eggplant that was discussed in the book. And so I'm not part of the experiment in UPLB, nor was I involved in the court case that later on ensued to question the field trials of the BT eggplant. But when the Philippine Supreme Court stopped the field test in the Philippines and later on changed his mind and said that, okay, you can go on with the test, the scientists in my university were confused and were going to me, so can you explain to us what happened? And so starting from there, I got involved and mulled over a lot of questions that brought me to where I am right now, doing my PhD at the Australian National University. And so my research uses as a case study the BT eggplant litigation in the Philippines, although I take a narrower look than what the book has brilliantly done, because I focus more on the interactions between the court and the scientists within the legal proceedings. So my reactions today are inspired by comparisons with the Philippine experience, especially on the legal administrative cases on GMOs discussed in part 2 of the book. And I take this opportunity to engage Aga's work in the context of my ongoing research. So the book, as many have said earlier, is a very thoughtful weave of textured fibers of history, politics, democracy, agriculture, rural development, and biotechnology into a multi-layered analysis that animates our thinking about democratic structures, how these reconfigure and are being reconfigured by technoscience. So the book's empirical accounts debunk, as earlier mentioned, many of the dominant narratives that have been going on in the GMO discourse, which are also prevalent in the Philippines. So first, the book is questioning this idea of like, yeah, activists, they're all the same. That's what scientists in the Philippines say. And we see from his ethnography that activists come from a broad range of movements, from farmers, women's groups, politicians, doctors, environmental and developmental lawyers, scientists, academics. In the Philippines, you might add to that a musician. So you have these people who are not all opposed to genetic engineering per se. Another myth is that activists are unscientific, they're anti-science. This was disproven in earlier studies like by Abby Kinchi in Mexico, and India adds to the evidence base. A scientific epistemology was at work when Greenpeace independently had sample Doritos chips tested for GM ingredients. And there's a very captivating discussion there in the book about this. An Indian activist, as mentioned earlier by Joiva, also employed a scientized tactic when they tapped international scientists to critique biosafety dossiers. And I go back to our experience in the Philippines just a few months back. I moderated a public discussion of a new study of Filipino perspectives on agribiotech. It showed that the key reservation against GM crops is the concern about corporate capture. And in that discussion, we asked, how would the science community and science communicators approach this social justice and equity sentiment? And a representative from ISA, which is also quoted in the book, easily gave an answer and said, look at the figures, like the growing number of hectarage of BT corn in the Philippines and in the world. And again, leading us to question, what is this farmer's choice? And as mentioned earlier, the ethnography shows us that the notion of farmer's choice is not as straightforward as it seems when we consider those merchants of knowledge, while these retailers are frontline sources of inputs for agriculture. Yes. Go ahead.
So we've got it. I think it's been working so far. Oh, yeah. I just surmised.
Zoom's on here now, but yeah, I think probably we should just
Should I
keep going.
Yeah. So so they need to see this, they just need to see the slides in Zoom as well as here, right? Yeah. So then we have to log on here to Zoom, the
Yeah.
same Zoom.
But so yeah, for this part of it, we're just doing, can you wait until she's done and then
Okay.
help us? Is that all right?
Yep.
Sorry, I'm really sorry, damsel.
Oh, no,
Trying to fix problems, creating problems.
Yeah. Sorry for the tech issues. But yeah, that's, I was saying, these merchants of knowledge, which I think Joiva already nicely shared with you earlier, shows that, well, the bottom line is still profit, but at the same time, you have these people at the forefront of dealing with the farmers. So, I'm sorry. I'll just So my law background drew my attention quite naturally to part 2 of the book, which shows, and I quote, India's regulatory regime for GM crops use 2 civic epistemologies, close quote, identified as the scientific vis-a-vis legal and administrative modes of thinking represented in bureaucratic documentation. This dichotomy typifies classic science versus law distinctions. But I think more than the distinction, it's the vacillation between the modes of reasoning that I found interesting and instructive. According to AGA, ambiguity results as contrasting epistemologies contend with each other. The book locates this ambiguity in the space between the 2 modes, or the gaps between the 2 epistemologies, which open a generative space for contestation. In this interstice, there is room to maneuver as claims are made and discounted. Through the book's discussion of scientific and legal administrative epistemology centered on textual representations, I observed similar tensions in the techno-legal skirmishes in the Philippine BT eggplant case. But in my study, the fusion between scientific and legal administrative reasoning did not seem to open a gap, but instead led to a point of convergence or overlap, where the paradigms of science and law were intensely intertwined. This overlap, like Professor Aga's gap, is also a generative space. In court proceedings, science and law seek to navigate their inevitable interface by insisting on their own authorities or boundaries, as Darren would say, and finding a way to maneuver, whether to disentangle or subsume the other, or perhaps find a more favorable entanglement or configuration of that would be happening. This intermeshing of modes of reasoning is apparent in the Doritos chips case and the GM mustard trials described in the book to illustrate epistemological confrontations and regulatory obscurities. The book presented the Doritos case as one where Greenpeace relied on scientific documentation embodied in the laboratory test result, which confirmed the presence of GM elements in chips sold in India. This was, however, trumped by legal administrative overtures, as described in the book. One was due to due process, like PepsiCo had to make its own representation, it had to be heard. Second was the burden of proof, which meant that Greenpeace, as the complainant, had to produce the bag of chips and the receipt. And failure to do so led to the dismissal of the case. It's important to underscore that while Greenpeace's approach was scientific, it was not solely scientific, as it was grounded on a legal tactic to begin with. They were contemplating and filing that case when they had the chips tested. The GM mustard case, on the other hand, was presented as a tale of, and I quote, how a scientific determination of uncertainty led the State Agriculture Department to withdraw an NOC, or no objection certificate, previously granted for field trials in Rajasthan. And this showed that the bureaucracy regulators had the opportunity to abandon precedent. But in the ethnography, you can see that there was really no consensus among scientists, yet the withdrawal of the NOC was concurrently predicated on concerns and textualizations that were legal administrative in nature. So one was the refusal of several states to allow trials, which were documented as outcomes of political deliberation and not really scientific, discussion. Second, the persuasive letter of Dr. Jyoti Mirdha to the chief of Rajasthan was a legal administrative script. So it was essentially a political appeal, a letter from a member of parliament who was also a medical doctor. And lastly, the position of Rajasthan's chief secretary highlighted a social-political justification, the need for a national consensus, not just among scientists, but from all stakeholders. It may be argued that whether the space where ambiguities happen is a fissure or an imbrication is inconsequential, and I'm just like nitpicking here for lack of something more substantial to say. But as I've articulated, the analytic interest is in, I quote, the different modes through which claims are made, adjudicated, and dismissed, and the way claims made by different registers enable and constrain bureaucratic decision-making. My thinking is that the gap where claims are contested implies a lacuna. There's a space and presumes that each register, the scientific and legal administrative modes are entirely separate from each other. Or in the two cases, it showed that the preeminence of the role of one mode of reasoning is not actually detached from the other. And this reflects an entanglement of scientific and legal administrative epistemologies that is anchored on what I saw from literature also as science and law's mutual constitution. So this does not mean that it's impossible to bar scientific from legal administrative. In fact, I find significant value in Aga's deconstruction of regulatory ratiocinations, particularly to understand epistemological shifts and translations, which he captivatingly described in the book. However, recognizing interlinked modalities in bureaucratic thought and documentation adds this critical dimension of ambiguity and complexity that I think must be deeply appreciated in techno-legal interactions. It complicates motivations, considerations, the space for maneuver, options for navigation, and their implications. The intertwined perspective that I forward is crucial in pursuing questions prompted by the book's analytic interest. For instance, some of the things that I thought about that are really relevant based on many of the things that the book has been saying is that, given these interlinkages between the two epistemologies, how can different modes of regulation be mobilized to enable bureaucratic decision-making? And at the same time, there was also a discussion here in the book about these interactions fostering or constraining democratic participation. And can these two epistemologies actually work together and complement each other to arrive at what development entrepreneurs call in policymaking to be scientifically or technically sound? and at the same time, administratively or politically possible decisions. Of course, the Philippines and India operate in different socio-technical landscapes, and the book is premised precisely on the importance of tracing specific historicities, paying critical attention to democratic processes, political cultures, bureaucratic structures, to understand the GMO debate and its repercussions on the relationships among science, the state, and publics. Through genetically modified democracy, Aga did a very remarkable job of unpacking and then hemming together all these into a very insightful piece, which gives useful guidance and inspiration to pursue parallel and new lines of inquiries to make sense of techno-scientific debates, which I think informs my study very much. So there's a lot more to say about the book, and I have other points that in the interest of time, I didn't mention, but I gave them to Professor Aga as well. And I really thank you for giving me this chance to engage with this work through also my work. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chancellor. That was so rich. And it's just amazing to find these incredible people who can make these incredible contributions. So is our projection guy has gone. So I suspect that the problem with the sound was because I was using this, and along with the flashing, I suspect there might be a problem with the connection. So I'm just not going to use I'm just going to use the computer sound from now on, and I think that will work better for the recording. That is my hope and expectation. So with that, I will hand over to you, Laura.
Okay, see you more.
Oh, yeah, I'm not sure what to do with the body.
It's totally fine. Yeah. Okay. Do I need to do anything with Zoom?
No.
Okay, great. So thank you so much for the invite. Like, I really appreciated the chance to engage with the work, and I'll be coming at it with a similar legal focus as well. So I'm going to elaborate on a few things too. So this robust ethnographic account of controversies over the introduction of GMOs in India, genetically modified democracy, really demonstrates how the science of GMO crops contends with these vastly different cultural and historical practices of knowing. So you have discussions that range from law to popular politics to farmers selling agrochemicals. And one of the interesting questions that animates the book is, quote, how do different ways of constructing truth claims collide with one another? And I think that was like the way I read through the book. So the careful reading of this really expert researched book, it's a fantastic model for how to do ethnographic work in all these different registers. But it also offers this guide for how the field of STS must think differently about the co-constituted relations of science, and this roadmap that really enables us to better ensure that the spaces, quote, where science in action meets democracy at work actually can enable possibilities for alternative dignified agriculture. So the book opens up with an expert account of the rise of biotechnology in India as state science. And that's a really important animating feature of the book. Like, Agat makes a very good point of like, this is a state science project. And it's driven by state agencies. So it's different than the historical trajectories, let's say, in the United States, where biotech is more driven through university industry partnerships. And so the account of the sort of the science of genetically modified crops becomes this arena of bureaucratic administration through the biotechnology department, which meant that the government, rather than private industry, was pushing this investment in the seeds. So the book expertly demonstrates how this had profound implications for science and democracy. So the bureaucratic rise of biotechnology was part of this shift in agricultural research to actually more narrow concerns of food production and supply. And I don't think of those as necessarily narrow concerns, but Aniket brilliantly was saying they're actually quite narrow because in doing that before, the focus was on questions of poverty. The focus was on questions of unequal caste-based access to land, water, credits, input. And so this bureaucratic shift to like food supply was actually narrow. So I think that was a really striking thing for me to think through in terms of how just the bureaucratic structuring of things really shifts how we address problems. So as someone who, so I've written on controversies around the patenting of the Hoodia plant, where I really appreciate your points of like, yes, we need to interview farmers and scientists and government officials. And so in my own work, I had done that. So I really loved that you did this amazing model of that. And so one of the things I'm working on now, though, is the emergence of precision agriculture and smart farming in the Western Cape. And so the book made me really think about paying attention to the bureaucratic structure of what's happening in South Africa. And so what's happening in South Africa is there's this rise of a presidential commission on artificial intelligence. And like, just think critically, like, how is the bureaucratic state formulating that? And it's disconnected from the Department of Agriculture. It's disconnected from the Department of Environment. So I think a very similar like point for all of us to think about is like, how are these structures being formulated and how are they not being formulated? So imagine if AI policy was actually in the environmental department, right? So I really appreciated you provoking that kind of thinking in my own work. So also kind of as a scholar trained in both law and in feminist science studies, I found the discussion of the regulation of biotechnology also to be quite informative. So genetically modified democracy offers this very skillful analysis of the regulation and how it does fuse these two epistemologies together in terms of one scientific and the other legal administration. And so I also want to kind of mention the Doritos case because it's very much a helpful way of thinking about what the main points in the book are. So in this 2008 case in which Greenpeace India filed a complaint with the Genetic Engineering Approval Committee. And so this case is, so Greenpeace claims that the bags of Doritos purchased in India contain unapproved genetically modified ingredients. Namely, it was herbicide tolerant soy and insect resistant corn. So while Greenpeace deployed scientific modes of documentation in the form of lab results, in contrast, the approval committee actually deployed both epistemologies. So they were asking, right, for testimony from Pepsi. Did you actually approve this? No, we didn't. And then asking for the receipt in terms of the purchase receipt. So they were really deploying the scientific. So what was interesting, though, is that Aga moves it through this question of files, right, to say that how important making truth claims comes through documents. So I thought like that was the rich ethnographic work. It's like positioning it as like this, the truth claims are made through the documents. And so it was a legal and administrative mode of producing truth rendered through scientific claims. So if there's no purchase receipt for the file, then the GM Doritos must not exist. So just an aside, there's a quote in the book where this officer says, if it's not in the file, it does not exist. And I think that's really important to thinking about how law makes their claims. So I used to practice law and it had a visceral reaction to that, like remembering standing up in courtrooms and judges saying to me, if it's not in the file, then if it's not in the record, it's admissible, counselor, right? So I think like just you reminded me of like, yeah, the point of the file and the evidence and document is really important to legal epistemologies. But returning to the book, so it was through this case of Doritos and the similar one over GM mustard that genetically modified democracy contends that examining these shifts and registers enables an understanding and tracking of power. So it's precisely the ambiguity that fosters democracy by enabling citizen groups like Greenpeace to assemble facts alongside with the government. But as the book argues, at the same time, this ambiguity constrains democracy. because the reliance on documents prevents claims that are true, but can't be documented, can't be textualized. And we learned that's the gap between these two epistemologies, where there's space for challenging power and developing new modes of democratic engagement with science. The ambiguity denotes an uncertainty that allows for new and marginal concerns to be addressed, which redraws boundaries between the state and society, expanding forums for participation and debate, right? So that very much shifts the meanings of democracy. And that's one of the things I loved about the book, is you were always bringing it back to democracy, right? I think that was probably what the prize really struck. I think that's the brilliance of the book. It does a beautiful job of ethnography. It does a fantastic job of showing this roadmap, and then it's constantly coming back to, and this is about democracy. So for example, in the context, because it is a state science project, the book contends that uncertainty makes room for, quote, technical critiques. And these are critiques of the scientific and legal administrative ways of producing facts. So this means that a broader range of the public can participate because of the credibility of the technical critiques, right? It doesn't depend on amassing a huge number of people, right? It depends on a small group of people that can make this technical critique. And the participation doesn't depend on place or identity, like some other social movements. It's really about the focus on the technicalities. So the book warns us, though, participation in democracy is limited because it does require a grasp of these technical details. So they think that's something to think about, and how important pedagogy and education are if this is the mode of democracy that you're bringing your attention to. So, and then there's also a possibility that a government minister might decide on a technicality to just go ahead with it and approve GMO crops. So I really liked that fine-grained analysis of questions of technicality. Yeah. So it's these later points, though, that give me pause and raise questions for us as scholars of science and technology. So if we assume that democracies are increasingly tilting towards authoritarian regimes, does uncertainty and ambiguity offer a space for challenging power, or does it push us into a quagmire of alternative facts? So I agree that it offers a way to understand power and some limited ways to challenge it. But are these pathways becoming more narrow? And how are we going to respond as a field? Additionally, as populist governments are attempting to dismantle the administrative capacities of the state to actually govern, then does uncertainty and ambiguity engender further instability and hinder the possibility for a more radical science and democracy towards social justice? So it seems to me that civil society and local movements might become even more important for producing a science and democracy of agriculture that does address broader issues of poverty, and is attending to legacies of settler colonialism and the return of lands to Native Indigenous peoples. So we as scholars of science and technology must continue to develop analysis that address and value multiple ways of knowing beyond the scientific and the legal administrative epistemologies that were so central to the book. So towards the end, genetic modified democracy brings attention to the complicated ways some farmer households are now navigating their alternative livelihoods as retailers of agrochemicals, a set of relationships that scholars of STS seldom address. So it's very much a significant part of the book to the field of science and technology. The book takes great care to discuss, so while some farmers are experiencing suicide, right, there's other groups of farmers who are capitalizing on the opportunities of agrochemicals to and change their livelihoods. And this tension was really striking. So while the book can do more, though, to discuss, I would love to hear, right, how the farmers' contributions to GM debates are actually through those registers of epistemology and expertise, right, to really think through that frameworks like in the other chapters. How are their ways of knowing gendered? And it really pushes the field, right, to consider those very heterogeneous lives and farmers in relation to science and democracy. And to conclude, right, I was also left wondering, what about the plants? So how might we think about plant epistemologies? So drawing upon multi-species ethnography and emerging conversations in feminist critical plant studies, and not to mention there's 3 panels of plants and engagements happening right now, and Joeva are actually on those panels. Like one's happening now. There's a whole series of panels on plant engagements. And so there's a lot of exciting conversations going on in this field, and it would be a perfect kind of conversation to have in terms of how do the plants shape the practices and debates of GM crops. In my case, in my research, I look at smart farming, or even how do we think about plant epistemologies when we're thinking about climate change? So I think your book brings out these questions for me. So there's also much uncertainty and ambiguity in how plants grow and impact our social worlds. So how might attention to plants open up a space for understanding science and democracy in new ways? So thank you, Aniket, for a wonderfully researched work and very thought-provoking.
Thank you to all of our wonderful speakers. So Aniket, can you sure. To us? And yeah, and then just to refresh after that, we'll take questions, but we would ask you to just come up and ask the question into the mic.
Good morning, everyone. I'm truly honored by this award, and I would like to begin by thanking the jury, Pablo Kreimer, Aya Kimura, Angela Okune, Marcus Suarez, Ayo Wahlberg, and the broader STS 4S community. Working in the field of STS in India, which is where I've been based for the past 5 years, which is where I was based until August, can sometimes feel lonely, and our group is still quite small, and this recognition really is a shot in the arm. Second, I'm extremely grateful and indebted to the environmental geographer and journalist Chitrangada Chaudhary, my wife, for help, advice, support, creative inputs, several other contributions, big and small, too numerous to recount. Much of this research has occurred thanks to her intellectual, logistical, and emotional support. A lot of the orientation towards questions of justice and democracy that I'm being praised for are actually things that I have learned from her own work as a journalist. Third, I wish to acknowledge the contributions of different scholars who have guided my work, notably A.R. Vasavi, Rajeshwari Rena, Isha Shah here, and also K. Shivaramakrishnan, James Scott, Karen Eber, and Sheila Jasnoff, and the small group of STS cohort in my doctoral program, of whom I see Amy Jang here in the audience. And above all, I would like to, I would really like to thank generations of Indian activists who have raised questions of critical knowledges, questions of science in a hierarchical, caste-ridden society, with ordinary people in mass audiences, and have lately been paying for their work with their lives. And, one last. Thank you, Emma, for setting this up. Congratulations on your new book. And thank you all to the panelists here for the generous and thought-provoking comments. This is such a treat. Now, I cannot hope to do justice to all the points that all of you have raised. So I'm going to limit my remarks to 2 or 3 cross-cutting points, and then maybe we can have a broader discussion with audience inputs and questions. Let me begin with the connections between uncertainty, science, and democracy, which all panelists have raised in different insightful ways. I agree with Damsel's observation. Damsel, I'm going to call you Damsel and not Professor Cortez, so kindly please just call me Aniket. I agree with Damsel's observation that legal, administrative, and scientific registers are entangled and even converge. And some of your close reading about how actually in the GM mustard case, maybe it was just the legal administrative register, is a doubt which continues to plague me. I would nonetheless see where this came from is, and since the panelists have already introduced the Doritos controversy, I'm not going to spend time describing it. These even Greenpeace in India is actually a very low budget organization. And for the past 5 or 6 years, it's virtually been shut down by the government. Their accounts are frozen. They've been caught up in all kinds of criminal litigation. So for them to send a bag of chips to Europe to get a test done is not really, it's not something which, it's not a tactic that most other environmental organizations in India would have been able to do. And I'm sure this cost them in ways that we don't quite, the financial burden is not to be underestimated even for Greenpeace India. And after doing all of this, I have interviewed some of these activists and they are horrified that there is GM food already in the country. What are we talking about? We are going on and on about these debates, but look, Doritos, which people consume. And the government keeps responding, where's the receipt? No, you still haven't shown us the receipt. How do we know you actually purchased it in India? How do we know you just didn't bring it from somewhere else into India? So this enormous divergence of the seriousness of the concern and almost the trivialization of the response coming from the apex regulatory office. That is what I was trying to understand, that, okay, if we are not going to fall into the trap, and I do not want to fall into the trap of, corrupt, inefficient third world regulators, which they are not, then how do we explain what they think this is about? And that's where I tried to draw this distinction between legal, administrative, and scientific. And I would still maintain that whether entangled or co-constituted, they are nonetheless different. And as I tried to argue in the book, they're different specifically in terms of the weight of how much weight they attach to precedents. Here it is also important to emphasize, and this I think may be where one reason why the Filipino case and the Indian case diverge, is that the GEAC is not a court of law. Judges in a courtroom are not technical experts, whereas GEAC, which is India's apex technical regulator, is staffed by biotechnologists, toxicologists, nutritionists. So at least in theory, they should be able to translate the precautionary principle into regulatory determinations. Their reluctance to do so is what allowed, and in a way what forced the then environment minister to organize what Latour would call a trial of strength via public hearings and reaching out to scientists across the world. So along with the activists, the minister himself was concerned that this apex regulatory body is not really behaving in technocratic ways. And which is where, the route to public hearing, which is how we got public hearings in India, and which really, I think, has been, Jason asked what the trajectory of my thinking post the publication of the book. I think that, I suspect, would be of some long-term significance, not immediately, because that is where, this opening up of whatever the criticisms of public hearings, it allowed, airing of certain matters of concern, which previous iterations of environmental governance in India were not having to listen to. This brings me to the very important question that you asked, Laura, about the relationship between uncertainty and doubt in authoritarian regimes and their penchant for alternative facts and fake news. Are activists skeptical of GMOs similar to those skeptical of climate change? Are they merchants of doubt in Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway's framing? Now, this is a question which I've been asked by some senior STS scholars also, and I want to just take a little bit of time to I'll be brief, but let me just assert why I think that is not the case, and why in any case we must have a different approach to the question of authoritarian regimes and fake news. Firstly, these activists are not merchants. Activism is risky business in India, and almost all of them are being persecuted in one or more ways, and they are not being really funded by any, big tobacco or big oil or anyone else for that matter. So first, I would dispute this notion of mercantilism in their case. Second, they are not parading endless doubt. As I note in the book, they are asking for robust tests which can be conducted within the paradigm of regulatory science. So Jason's brought up this extremely famous PNAS article from 2012, which talks about the performance of BT cotton among smallholders. Smallholders is in the title and the abstract. The very reason it got published in PNAS is because it's the first paper to show, look, GM crops work for smallholders. And its sample is the top 6% of Indian. I mean, you cannot take the smallholder standard of the United States and apply it to India. People who are farming 10 acres in India are the very large landholders and the politically connected rich, not even rich farming households. Now, to make this point is not to indulge in some conspiracy of endless uncertainty. Nonetheless, the broader question is very important. And I must point out with enormous sense of disappointment and anger that India currently is actually at the forefront of global industrial scale fake news production, which, if not sanctioned by the state, then certainly seems to be tolerated by the state. Very topically, I don't know how many of you have picked up on this, but a lot of fake news currently emerging on the Israel-Gaza, I can't even call it conflict, it's so one-sided, is arising out of India. And so my own view here is not that we double down on science, but that we continue demanding more robust science in terms of methods, but more broad-based science in terms of questions, perspectives, and participation. So that to me is a more difficult but ethical and promising response to the epidemic of fake news perverted by authoritarian fascist regimes in different parts of the world, and wholly to be preferred than the other response, which I confess I feel a bit dismayed, because I do hear that other response also in fora like these, that we abandon everything that post-colonial critics, feminist critics, indigenous knowledge-based critics, anti-racist critics, anti-caste critics have taught us, and somehow protect science because people don't want to take vaccines or people don't believe in climate change. The idea of democratizing science does not mean that everyone automatically is an expert, but it does mean, at least to me, holding on to the methodological rigor of different scientific disciplines. All of them have their own methodological yardsticks, while democratizing in terms of who gets to set the agenda for science. That would be how I respond to this. And further, living in democracies does mean that we defer to political representatives to make judgment calls. And our work is to make sure that facts are in order. Beyond that, we may or may not succeed in persuading political representatives. So, an Indian government may well decide that BT eggplant is something worth commercializing, may well decide GM mustard is well commercializing, and that is the price of a democratic government, that they will make decisions. As an STS scholar, I feel our responsibility is to make sure that the regulatory science is robust, beyond which there is political judgment. This brings me to Jason's question about high quality versus high intensity engagement. And, partly the struggle to keep the book within 90,000 words, partly the struggle to finish it, and partly this tension between keeping the ethnography versus making sure that this is not just some, exotic Indian story, led me to make certain choices, because of which I now realize in retrospect that some of the most high quality engagement moments in the debate in India have got relegated to the footnotes. But, I can mention one here, which is we did see very high quality engagement when a standing parliamentary committee examined the issue. It was really a joy to see elected representatives from different political parties, different caste and regional backgrounds, interrogate bureaucrats and technocrats ask very sharp questions, precisely because biotechnology evolved here, as in some other countries as well, as a state science. And therefore, parliamentarians had every business demanding how it was that this program was serving a public purpose. I could offer more examples, but what I want to point out is that in some ways, the regulatory decision about yes or no to a particular issue is already too late. Activists have been demanding a say in what problems get taken up by state science. As I said, democratization of science means public oversight and shaping and broad-based participation in shaping its agenda. And your intuition, Jason, is spot on. Instead of opening up to more robust questions, the government has short-circuited all processes by taking gene-edited crops away from the Environment Ministry effectively, which at least to me suggests that robust science is still one arena where authoritarian regimes falter. And here I'm inspired by Joeva's formulation that she shared with me on email and also here, that global movements have to hold together different struggles while also working in unity. Absolutely. I'm not trying in this book to say that India is different or exceptional, but the point is that the struggles everywhere do have to be grounded in regional histories of science and politics. And therefore, the work of assembling them into a global story has to be done with more diligence and attention to detail and attention to these life forms too, as Laura pointed out, which is not something which I've been able to do adequately in the book. Finally, let me just come back to the question of how my own thinking has changed since this publication. Today, I feel even more sure that the question that needs to be debated, so if we are discussing India, is what changes do we want in Indian agriculture and food, and what role can technology play in shepherding those changes? If we are to ask the question at that level, it will become fairly clear, for instance, I think it will become fairly clear that herbicide-tolerant crops are not suitable to the context of a large, unequal agrarian country. And if we can settle that question in terms of its suitability itself, then we avoid getting into the quagmire of toxicity, public health, cancer, is our 40 rats enough or not? The kind of questions in which the Cerulli paper got bogged down. And I'm recognizing even more and more that agroecology is what really needs much more work. And especially since invariably the questions about GMOs get reduced to the questions about how do we feed the world. And more, not to say that there is one unitary field of research in agroecology, but more and more evidence is mounting that we can feed, that farmers can feel, not we. It's never really understood who the we is when the question is how do we feed the world. Farmers can enjoy more autonomy, more dignity, and less dependence on exploitative sources, while cultivating a diverse basket of culturally appropriate foods. It seems to me agroecology has more clues to that question, certainly than either gene-edited crops or the GM crops that we have seen so far. Having a separate body for regulation certainly helps. Separation of promoting agencies with regulatory ministries is a good idea, I think, but that itself will not lead to strong regulation unless movements exert pressure on the regulatory arm. And institutionally, the question of food and agriculture cannot be monopolized by the much narrower biotech industry and not even by the much narrower food supplies ministry or food supplies department. Once again, thank you very much for the prize and the critical engagement. Finally, Yale University Press could not be here, budget cuts. So the work of marketing is on me. So there is a 30% discount offered by the press with the code Y23, my last name AGA, Y23 AGA, in case any of you are interested in buying it. And if you are, I certainly will not complain. Thank you very much. Sure.
Thank you so much, Aniket. That was just wonderful. And can I check with coaching Ingrid Sung? Can you hear can you hear the sound? Just give a thumbs up.
Yeah, it's working now.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Okay, I wanted to now ask for questions from the floor. Yes, please come up. And if you want to identify yourself.
Maybe all the panelists can come up.
Yeah, do you guys want to, come up here?
My name is Aisha Shah. I had the privilege of actually doing the first ethnography of BT cotton cultivation in Gujarat when it was not approved by GAC. This was illegal cultivation, actually transferred from Pakistan and Afghanistan route, actually, and that's what my credentials, why Yale University Press, actually, I think this is when the book is out now and when it has won the prize. It is not very inappropriate to say that I was asked to review actually the first few chapters. I have never said that to Aniket, but now that he has won the prize, I feel somehow involved into that honor actually. So I have two questions for Aniket and of course for the panel who is involved in this, in looking at this question. One of the questions about the democracy is that Jairam Ramesh, actually, the whole public series of public hearing that happened because of the initiative of this very enterprising minister Jairam Ramesh, actually, which had a very radical academic background, which is very unusual actually for a parliamentarian in India to happen. So I always assigned actually that kind of a democratic role to his personality. And then after BJP came to power, actually, because this happened, Jairam Ramesh was a minister in Congress. And when BJP came to power, I was very nervous that the regulation is now going to change and probably a series of genetically modified crops would get the approval, but it did not. And BJP actually is very famously very authoritarian in terms of its many political decisions. So I'm kind of very curious, actually. And on one side, I'm very proud that India has actually stuck between these two governments for a number of decades, actually, to not give any approval. Why do you think, Aniket, actually, that this similarity, this continuity happened between Congress and BJP government? So that's the first question. The second one actually relates to more about the STS concepts. Actually, here we are in the Forest Conference, and I have personally found STS very Western centric in terms of its conceptual and its theoretical frameworks. And often I found those concepts and theories being applied to post-colonies like India in my own work, because I'm also an STS scholar working on India, in Indian agriculture, water issues, that often these concept theories produce a kind of an opaque picture of post-colonies. And say, for instance, civic epistemologies. Civic epistemologies means actually some kind of a stylized national civic culture of regulatory mechanism, because Jessenov compares UK, US, and Germany in her book on regulation of GMOs. But as you show in your book, actually, that how these regulatory debates in India are kind of epistemological crossfires, that there are militant oppositions, and it's very difficult to define it in terms of some kind of a nationalized civic, culture. So I would like to invite also your response on what kind of feelings or thinking you had about applying STS concepts into this particular scenario in the post-colonies like India.
I thought I thought the hardest part of the panel was over. Those are both very important questions. Let me take the second one first. That is an assessment that I share too. In fact, in 2015, I think the forest was in Denver, and Amy and we had put together two panels, correct? Two panels at the forest in Denver, precisely on this question. It was the panels were just called STS in the Global South, but we were trying very much to address this, that that somehow, unwittingly perhaps, things happening in large sections of the world get folded into, some instance of a theory generated in the north. And I would really, since the forest has been given this prize to me, I'm going to use this pulpit to say that that we really need to. It's not a plea for it doesn't necessarily mean any kind of cultural essentialism. But it does mean that if we want to be talking about India or Brazil, we do have to pay attention to, I think in one sentence, I think it's important to understand not so much cultural difference than historical difference. That post-colonial societies and maybe, depends on what period we are talking about, that may not be the governing binary, colonial, post-colonial, imperial, post-imperial. But whatever it is, we have to pay attention to how knowledge traditions in a particular landscape have evolved, how they've got transformed by the insertion of a country into an as yet ongoing imperial world system, and locate controversies there in the terms of those historical dynamics. That would be my response to your second question. In terms of the first question, I mean, it's funny you asked that. That actually is the subject of an article which I'm just about to finish and submit, about this persistence of some kind of regulatory consensus where there's so much else that the new government, Modi regime, has undone, but not the so far stalemate on the GM issue. And my own sense is that it's partly happening because of, when I said that the public hearings were of lasting significance, this is what I was implicitly referring to, that politicized the controversy in such a way that a large number of people who may have no particular affinity for the Congress and may well, in fact, be supporters of the BJP, also share concerns about GM crops and are articulating it. So that is the expansion. This is that is in some ways the introgression of the debate into the genome of Indian democracy. The other retarding force may be the Supreme Court.
Just want to add actually that we are organizing a open panel on the ESS Forest Conference that will happen in Amsterdam, and we have named it as a Rethinking SDS Through from Global South. And we are inviting actually presentations on questioning and presenting new theories and new concepts entirely focused on Global South. So please do consider submitting your presentation.
So just in case you guys didn't hear, we just got a plug for one of the many open panels for the East Forest Conference in Amsterdam next year for rethinking STA's concepts from the Global South. Is that correct? So yes, look for that out for that one. The list will be out very soon. So yeah, who would like to? Thank you so much for that, and I feel like you should be here on the panel, but thank you for sharing. Yeah, who else?
She's on the panel tomorrow.
Oh, that's right. Okay. Who would?
That's the current book. Actually, yours is a past. I'm present. Aniket is a dear friend, and I'm very pleased that he has got this prize.
Well, I think it is the first prize to a scholar based in India.
That's right.
Although now you've left. So yeah, are there other questions that people would like to come and ask? Yeah, does anyone else on the panel want to follow up? I mean, those particular questions were very India specific, but have they raised some reflections for you in terms of the how regulation works? We've got such wonderful expertise here about Ghana, the Philippines, US, South Africa. Have you got any
Or, thoughts on the question about uncertainty and alternative facts?
or any
Yeah. I mean, I think.
sorry,
Oh,
come up
yeah.
here.
So one of the reasons why I raise that question is because you read the book and then literally you get to the last page and you're like, well, the Modi government is now shifting in this way. And so that's kind of why I asked that. Like the book is this wonderful roadmap of here's all the places of ambiguity and uncertainty that we could look to open up. And then you mention on the last page, like, but then again, we have this new government. And so I think that's where I was concerned. It was less about the ambiguity from and uncertainty from activists. It was more about the uncertainty, ambiguity in the government. And if this project is such a state science government project, then what does that mean? So yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and so I'll just say to that, and it may still happen. I mean, I end the book by saying it's hanging by a thread. It is still hanging by a thread. So, we have elections coming in about 6 months, I guess, and this particular government, generally governments like to make big bold announcements before elections. This government more so than any other. So we'll see.
Yeah, well, I was just, but I just was saying that, like organic hasn't really worked very well for Sri Lanka, so I don't know if India will be going down that path.
I also had another question because I think this question about global South concepts is a really interesting one. So I wanted to ask something about that actually. I'm curious about how your book has been received or like what questions you've been getting where you feel like there's a tension between approaches to the book coming from the global North versus approaches to it coming from the global South. Does that make sense? What questions are you getting that reveal a tension between these registers?
Okay. I'm just going to say one thing about the organic thing that you mentioned, which is, and that's another strange convergence happening. The organic debate as it plays out, certainly in South Asia, I can't speak for the other parts of the world, is peculiar in the sense that there's enormous hostility towards organic from a certain older tradition of Marxism. So when it comes to debunking organic, so again, for genetically modified crops, this is not, it's a bit, I don't think, it's one of the things I could not do justice to. The parliamentary left parties were actually quite divided on that question because they thought that, we cannot afford technophobia. And after all, unless the transition to a capitalist agriculture happens, how will transition to a... So, this teleological kind of thinking that we have to march that path first before we reach any kind of socialist utopia, that's very much alive. And yes, and that is also playing into how people understand at the policy level organic, and it's a conflict which does not easily fall on the left-right binary. In terms of responses to the book, I can't say that I've noticed much divergence coming from scholars in different parts of the world, except for that I do get questions, somewhat impatient questions from well-meaning and sincere questions, but impatient questions from many people, students especially in India, that surely agriculture is in such big crisis. If there's anything which has even a remote shot of helping, how can we say no to it? And that's which is why I really feel that at least I've come around to the view that it could not be more important to fund agroecological research, to connect it with living traditions of farming in the subcontinent, and to advocate, to popularize them, because then it's not like a status quo or a new technology. There's something, there's a third thing that can be offered to people who are looking out a way out of that morass.
Sashank, do you want to come to the front? Yep. And then we've had, did you want to, okay, great.
Hi, I'm Santosh Kumar. So I just started my PhD, not just started, but I'm in third year of my PhD, and I'm also working on STS. So I'm doing lab ethnography and trying to understand epigenetics. So I was just, I've gone through your book, and I was thinking, like the title itself is Genetically Modified Democracy. And I'm also trained as an engineer, biotechnology and biochemical engineering. So I was thinking that this book is more tilted towards regulatory regime. So what will be your reflection, when you maybe try to incorporate Indian scientists, how, especially the science, then what direction the book will take?
Will we take?
Yeah. Do you want to, so, yep, you, sorry. Yes, and then.
We're going to do the promenade, isn't it?
Yes. And introduce yourself.
Okay, yeah, so it's Rob Smith from the University of Edinburgh. Congratulations on the book. And I would say also it's genuinely amazing to see a biotech book get a Fleck Prize here when everything at the moment is about AI, and when there are like 10 talks, I think, if you put bio into the program, you find. So really congratulations on that. And I'm definitely going to use your discount code. I was curious when you said that you had arrived at this formulation of like your responsibility to the field, and that you said that you kind of thought that your responsibility was to produce or ensure the science was robust, and then there was the question of politically what happens kind of beyond that is something that you're not in control of. And we do a lot of work, I suppose, where it's kind of, again, very kind of up close in these political debates, and these questions are always at the forefront. So I was curious how you arrived at that particular formulation. There are obviously similarities with the kind of boundary drawing that scientists would do in that formulation. So if you could say more about that. It's also something that I suspect the panel will have things to say about. So if anyone else wanted to talk to that, that would be really good to hear as well.
Lost track of my time.
Hi, I'm Sujata Raman from Australian National University. So Aniket, I was really struck by one of the questions that you posed towards the end of your response, where I think you said something like, maybe the questions we need to be asking in STS are something like, for example, what kind of science and technology do we need for the food system in improving the food system in India, for example. And I was really struck by that, because those are the kinds of questions we tend not to ask, I think, in STS to orient inquiry. Maybe I'm making a gross generalization, but yet they're really important, right? And it's often something that people are interested in. People we engage with, whether it's policymakers or civil society or scientists, often they want to know, okay, so we understand some of these critiques, but how do we go beyond? What do we do next? And that sort of thing. So I guess, I was wondering, what kind of methods do you think we would need for pursuing those kinds of questions? Is it enough to have like ethnographic methods? Do those kinds of forms of research need to happen in other ways? Or to be accomplished, in conversation with scientists, policymakers, and so forth. So yeah, if you could speak to the kind of approaches, frameworks, methods, and again for the rest of the panel as well. Thank you.
That'd be great. Yep. So we'll have Aniket and then anyone else who wants to, and then we'll talk them. Will be at time.
Okay, so I'll be brief so that there's time to hear, because these are all three questions are in some ways questions where each of the panelists can speak from their respective context. So very quickly, Santosh, the question is not what do scientists think? The question is which scientists are we asking? And when you're talking about something as foundational as food and agriculture and as complex as food and agriculture in a stratified, agroecologically diverse society like India, it's very important to do that due diligence first. And as I show in the book, what has happened with the rise of biotechnology is, in fact, the much broader field of agricultural research has got progressively marginalized. And so that's how I would respond to you. How did I arrive at that? So I arrived at it. I can't say I very consciously arrived at it, and this is very much work in progress. I'm still learning. But the point is that in many parts of the world, we have seen what authoritarian science can do. So and as a field, as STS field has come around to the view that leaving to the experts is not a good enough endpoint. You cannot short circuit to leaving it to the experts. Again, which is why I was saying that, I suspect that the price of democracy is that political representatives will use their judgment. And this is something also incidentally in political theory where the role of expertise is to inform rather than take decisions for political representatives. So that's where I was coming to, that authoritarians, we know what authoritarian science looks like, and we cannot revert to that. We also know what political authoritarianism looks like, and we don't want that. So then how do we do this? And the best thing I could come up with it is that the political representative system retains its integrity. Our work is to make sure that the science that feeds decision making is robust, and we are challenging its silences. And in cases like this, sometimes just bad science. We need all kinds of approaches to ask that question, but I was not saying that only as a research agenda. I was more saying that if I were to think like a science policymaker, currently you have lots of reports, even in the US, in other parts of the world also, about what GM can do and cannot do, and safe or unsafe. But I feel that the real question before science policy-making bodies should be the big political questions. That, what kind of transition does Indian agriculture need? That's where I was coming to. Yeah. Thank you.
Just very quickly to Rob's question about the sort of our role of making sure the science good. I worry about that. I think, I understand, I think I'm influenced by Roger Pielke's book, The Honest Broker, in terms of thinking about the ways that experts can interface with policymaking. But I think as a discipline, STS needs to be willing to cross that boundary and take advantage of that. And I think, one way to put it is that both truth and power are negotiated on both sides, among scientific experts and among decision makers. And if both of those things are being negotiated in both places, I think we need to be willing to go to those places and to ask questions and to try to influence how things get negotiated on both sides. So I hope that we do more than just making sure the science is right, because in my own experience, it's just never that neat of a story. And I think some of what we have to offer as science, technology, and society, and not just science and technology studies, is that we get to think about the society part and how those integrations and how those contests work.
Yeah. So can we give you the last word?
Oh, sorry.
No.
Yeah, I just want to add a bit about some of the interrelated questions that were raised. One is about like, yeah, that getting that science right. And I agree with Jason that it's like continuous negotiation from both sides, from science and policy. And in our case, like from our experience in the Philippines, it's also getting the policymakers, and in my studies, specifically the courts, to understand which science is right and having the mechanisms for that. But of course, it leads us to this very dangerous, slippery slope of like, do we make our jurists scientists? And it goes back again to this our idea of democratizing the science and being able to like have a broader set of groups to contribute to that question. And I think that is also related to what Sujata, who is my supervisor, by the way, my great supervisor, to what she raised about that big question of like, how can technology help improve that? And going into zooming out into asking that is also the challenge, because when you get to the scientists, they say that that's not our question. Our question is like, yeah, just on the technology, the ethics of that, the effects of that, it's the regulators who will think about that. But then opening to them that, hey, yeah, you give the information, but we're doing this democratically. We're doing this in a bigger space with more people, with more groups to discuss and think about these bigger questions where you can participate and they can participate as well. I think that's the role that we should push for, apart from the robustness of the science that we'd like to be, of course, there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So yeah, unless there's any pressing.
May I just
Yes, of course.
Yeah, so thank you for both those remarks. And when I heard them, I also heard what my own response to Rob's questions sounded like. No, I'm all for science, technology, and society. However, what I was trying, especially in stratified countries where even your scientists come from a very narrow social base, which is less of a problem in some countries, but certainly a big problem in India. Most of the science policymakers represent the top stratum of Indian caste hierarchy. So there, before the democratization of the social base of science itself has happened, I feel worried about substituting, the privileged access that scientists, even a social scientist like me, can enjoy to a legislative body. I also feel a little afraid of that, given the narrow base from which so much research emerges in contexts like South Asia. So ultimately, I would say that, answering your question, the first step to even beginning to answer that question is the prior democratization of research. In terms of not that everyone is an expert, but the kinds of people who can get into PhD programs, who can get to write books like this. And then, a lot of that higher order uncertainty may perhaps sort itself out, or then we attack that.
Thank you so much. Yes, excellent conclusion. Thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you so much to you guys for great questions. And yeah, congratulations. Okay, so you guys want to head upstairs after a break. There is coffee around, and then we will be having our plenary panel, special plenary upstairs in 20 minutes.